Daisha lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in North Omaha, Nebraska, in the spring of 2021. The building, a faded brick structure from the 1960s, had peeling paint on the walls and a persistent leak in the ceiling that dripped into a rusted bucket during heavy rains. Her life revolved around her job as a cashier at a local supermarket, where she scanned groceries for 8 hours a day, earning just enough to cover rent, utilities, and the mounting interest on her student loans from a community college program she never finished. The weight of financial strain pressed on her constantly, leaving little room for dreams beyond survival. Her mother, who lived a few blocks away in a similar apartment, often reminded Daisha of the importance of perseverance, but the words felt hollow against the backdrop of unpaid bills and a refrigerator that held only a half-empty carton of milk and some leftover takeout. Each morning, Daisha woke to the sound of her neighbor's television blaring through the thin walls, a reminder of the world moving on without her. She would pull on her worn sneakers, tie her hair back, and walk to the bus stop under the grey Nebraska sky, her breath visible in the early spring chill. The supermarket, a sprawling chain store with fluorescent lights and endless aisles, offered no respite from her worries. Customers barely noticed her as she scanned their items, her hands moving mechanically while her mind wandered to the life she had once imagined, perhaps owning a small business or moving to a city where opportunities felt within reach. Those dreams had faded over the years, replaced by the reality of a paycheck that disappeared before the next one arrived. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, Daisha stopped by her mother's apartment for dinner. The smell of fried chicken filled the small kitchen, a rare treat that her mother had prepared to lift her spirits. As they sat at the wobbly table, Daisha noticed a crumpled flyer on the counter tucked under a stack of mail. It advertised a program for surrogate motherhood at a reproductive clinic downtown. The flyer promised a substantial payment, enough to change a person's life, and listed a phone number for inquiries. Daisha's mother, catching her gaze, warned her about the emotional toll of such a decision, recounting a story of a distant cousin who had struggled after giving up a child. But Daisha, staring at the flyer, saw not just the risks, but a glimmer of hope, a way to clear her debts, move to a better apartment, and maybe even save enough to start over. Over the next few days, Daisha couldn't shake the idea. She carried the flyer in her purse, pulling it out during breaks at work to reread the bolded promises of financial stability. She researched the clinic online, using the library's free computers since her phone's data plan was too limited for extensive browsing. The clinic's website showcased smiling families and testimonials from women who described the process as empowering. Daisha read about the medical screenings, the legal contracts, and the support provided to surrogates. The money, tens of thousands of dollars, felt like a lifeline. She imagined paying off her loans, moving to a place where the roof didn't leak, and maybe even enrolling in night classes to finish her degree. The thought of carrying a child for someone else seemed daunting, but the clinic emphasized that the baby would belong to the intended parents, with no genetic connection to the surrogate. After a week of sleepless nights, Daisha made up her mind. She called the clinic and scheduled an appointment, her hands trembling as she dialed the number. The following Tuesday, she took a rare day off work and rode the bus to the clinic, a sleek glass building that stood out against Omaha's modest skyline. The waiting room was pristine, with soft music playing, magazines neatly arranged on glass tables. A coordinator, a woman with a warm smile and a clipboard, explained the process in detail. Daisha would undergo medical and psychological evaluations, and if approved, she would be matched with a couple seeking a surrogate. The coordinator introduced Daisha to Martez and Claire, a couple from a wealthier part of town who had been trying to start a family for years. Their profile described them as professionals with a stable home, eager to welcome a child through surrogacy. Daisha listened carefully as the coordinator outlined the legal agreement. The contract would ensure that Daisha had no parental rights to the child, who would be created using Claire's egg and Martez's sperm through in vitro fertilization. The process felt clinical, almost detached, but the financial compensation was spelled out clearly. enough to cover her debts and give her a fresh start. Daisha asked questions about the medical risks and the timeline, her mind racing with both excitement and apprehension. The coordinator assured her that the clinic would provide housing, medical care, and a stipend during the pregnancy, easing the burden of her daily struggles. By the end of the meeting, Daisha felt a mix of relief and uncertainty, but the promise of a better future outweighed her doubts. When Daisha returned home that evening, she sat on her threadbare couch and stared at the contract she had been given to review. The pages were filled with legal jargon, but the numbers stood out, money that could change everything. She thought of her mother's warnings, but also of the leak in her ceiling, the overdue bills, and the exhaustion of living paycheck to paycheck. With a deep breath, she signed the contract, her pen moving carefully across the page. The decision felt monumental, a step toward a life she had long stopped believing was possible. As she mailed the contract back to the clinic the next day, Daisha felt a flicker of hope, unaware of the emotional journey that lay ahead. Daisha settled into the new apartment provided by the clinic, a modest but clean one-bedroom unit in a quiet part of Omaha, far from the creaking floors and leaking ceilings of her old place. The space felt like a luxury she had never known, with fresh paint on the walls, a refrigerator stocked with groceries by a delivery service, and a bed that didn't sag in the middle. The clinic's support staff ensured she had everything she needed, from prenatal vitamins to weekly appointments with an obstetrician who worked exclusively with their surrogacy program. For the first time in years, Daisha didn't worry about how she would pay for her next meal or whether the electricity would be cut off. She felt a sense of stability that was both comforting and unfamiliar, a stark contrast to the relentless grind of her previous life. As the weeks of her pregnancy progressed, Daisha adapted to the routine of medical checkups and dietary guidelines. She visited the clinic regularly, where nurses took her vitals and ran ultrasounds, their faces professional but kind. The images on the screen, grainy at first, showed the tiny form of the baby growing inside her. Daisha watched the monitor with a mix of curiosity and detachment, reminding herself that this child belonged to Martez and Claire. The clinic had been clear. The baby was created using their genetic material, and her role was purely physical, a vessel for their dreams. Yet, as the first trimester turned into the second, Daisha began to feel subtle movements like tiny flutters beneath her skin. These sensations, faint at first, grew stronger, and she found herself resting her hand on her belly, tracing the curve where the baby stirred. The apartment, though comfortable, felt sterile without personal touches. Daisha filled the quiet evenings by borrowing books from the local library, a short walk from her new home. She chose novels at first, but her curiosity led her to a section on parenting and pregnancy. She checked out a worn copy of a book about motherhood, its pages dog-eared from years of use. Sitting on her couch with a cup of tea, she read about fetal development, bonding, and the emotional changes of pregnancy. The words stirred something in her, a warmth she hadn't expected. She began to imagine the baby's face, wondering if he would have bright eyes or a soft laugh. Without realizing it, she started calling the baby Joshua in her mind, a name that came to her one night as she lay in bed, feeling his gentle kicks. Daisha tried to push these thoughts away, reminding herself of the contract she had signed. She pulled out the paperwork sometimes, rereading the clauses that outlined her role and the legal boundaries of her involvement. The words were cold and unambiguous. She had no claim to the child, and her job was to deliver a healthy baby to Martez and Claire. Yet, the more she felt Joshua move, the harder it became to maintain that distance. During quiet moments, she found herself humming softly to her belly, songs her mother used to sing to her as a child. She wondered what kind of life Joshua would have, whether Martez and Claire would read to him at night or take him to parks on weekends. These thoughts brought both comfort and unease, as she realized she was painting a picture of a child she would never truly know. The clinic's staff noticed Daisha's growing introspection during her appointments. A counselor, part of the surrogacy program, met with her monthly to ensure her emotional well-being. Daisha answered the questions carefully, assuring the counselor that she understood her role and was committed to the process. But she kept her private thoughts locked away, afraid that admitting her attachment would jeopardize the arrangement or expose her to judgment. She avoided calling her mother during these months, knowing the older woman would sense her turmoil and urge her to stay detached. Instead, Daisha filled her days with small routines, walks around the neighborhood, cooking meals from the clinic's suggested recipes, and reading more about the baby's development. Each milestone, like the first time she felt a distinct kick, deepened the bond she was trying to resist. As her belly grew, Daisha's connection to Joshua became undeniable. She bought a small notebook from a dollar store and began jotting down moments she wanted to remember, the way he seemed to move more when she played music or how he settled when she ate certain foods. She told herself it was just a record for her own peace of mind, a way to process the experience, but the act of writing felt like claiming a piece of him. Late at night, when the apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator, Daisha would sit by the window, looking out at the city lights and wonder if she could truly let go when the time came. The contract loomed in her mind, a reminder of her obligation, but Joshua's presence inside her felt more real than any signature on a page. She wrestled with guilt, knowing she was breaking an unspoken rule, but the love she felt was stronger than her fear of consequences. By the end of the second trimester, Daisha's emotions were a tangled mix of joy and dread. She cherished the moments of connection with Joshua, yet each one made the future more daunting. She avoided thinking too far ahead, focusing instead on the present, the weight of her belly, the rhythm of his movements, the quiet hope that she could carry him safely to term. The clinic's support continued, with nurses praising her health and the baby's progress. But Daisha felt increasingly alone in her secret. She knew she couldn't share her feelings without risking everything, so she carried them silently, her heart growing heavier with each passing day. The summer heat in Omaha clung to Daisha's skin as her pregnancy neared its end, but the baby arrived earlier than expected. In the early hours of a muggy August morning in 2021, sharp contractions woke her from a restless sleep. She grabbed her phone, hands trembling, and called the clinic's emergency line. Within an hour, an ambulance arrived at her apartment, and she was rushed to a hospital affiliated with the surrogacy program. The sterile hallways and the steady beeping of monitors blurred around her as nurses guided her to a delivery room. The labor was intense but swift, lasting just under 6 hours. Daisha gripped the bed rails, her body exhausted but driven by an instinct she couldn't name. When the baby emerged, a healthy boy, the room filled with the sound of his cries, sharp and piercing in the clinical quiet. The nurses worked quickly, cleaning the newborn and wrapping him in a soft blanket. Daisha, still catching her breath, caught a fleeting glimpse of his tiny face, dark eyes blinking against the harsh hospital lights, a small hand curling into a fist. She wanted to reach for him, to hold him against her chest, but a nurse gently explained that the intended parents would meet the baby first. Before she could process the moment, the boy was whisked out of the room. Daisha lay back, her body aching, her mind reeling from the sudden absence. The doctor congratulated her on a successful delivery, but the words felt distant, like they belonged to someone else's story. She stared at the ceiling tiles, counting them to keep her emotions at bay, but a hollow ache settled in her chest. Within hours, Martez and Claire arrived at the hospital. Daisha saw them through the glass window of her recovery room, their faces alight with joy as they held the baby, now named Elijah. The clinic's coordinator visited Daisha, carrying a clipboard with the final paperwork. The documents, crisp and official, outlined her relinquishment of any rights to Elijah. Daisha's hand hovered over the pages, her pen heavy as she signed her name. The coordinator thanked her warmly, calling her contribution a gift. But Daisha felt no pride, only a numbing emptiness. Martez and Claire stopped by briefly, their gratitude sincere but brief. They spoke of their excitement to bring Elijah home, their words filled with a happiness Daisha couldn't share. She nodded, forcing a smile, but her eyes lingered on the bundle in Claire's arms, a glimpse of Elijah's tiny head nestled against her shoulder. Discharged the next day, Daisha returned to her old apartment in North Omaha, the clinic's temporary housing no longer needed. The familiar creak of the floorboards and the faint smell of mildew greeted her, a stark contrast to the clean, modern apartment she had lived in for months. The clinic's payment had been deposited into her account, a substantial sum that cleared her student loans and left enough to cover rent for a year. She sat on her worn couch, staring at the bank statement on her phone, expecting relief, but finding none. The money felt like a transaction, a cold exchange for the warmth she had carried for 9 months. She tried to focus on practical steps, paying bills, buying groceries, returning to her supermarket job, but her thoughts kept drifting to Elijah, to the weight of his movements she no longer felt. In the days that followed, Daisha struggled to reclaim her routine. She went back to work, scanning items and exchanging small talk with customers, but her mind wandered to the hospital room, to the fleeting moment she saw Elijah's face. At night, she lay awake, replaying the memory of his cries, wondering if he was sleeping soundly in Martez and Claire's home. She opened the notebook she had kept during her pregnancy, its pages filled with notes about Joshua, the name she had given him in secret. The words felt like a lifeline, a connection to a child she was never meant to keep. She traced her own handwriting, each entry a reminder of the bond she had tried to suppress. Unable to shake her thoughts, Daisha turned to the internet. Using her phone to search for information about surrogacy, she found forums where women shared their experiences, some describing the process as empowering, others admitting to lingering grief. She read about legal cases, rare instances where surrogates had fought for custody, though most ended in defeat. The stories stirred a restless hope in her, a flicker of possibility that she might see Elijah again. She hesitated to act, knowing the contract she had signed was ironclad, but the idea of letting him go completely felt unbearable. She saved articles and bookmarked websites, her research becoming a quiet obsession, a way to hold on to the child she had carried. Daisha avoided contacting the clinic, fearing they would dismiss her feelings or remind her of her obligations. She also kept her thoughts from her mother, who had warned her about the emotional risks of surrogacy. Instead, she carried her longing in silence, tucking it away like the notebook she now hid in a drawer. The days stretched into weeks, and while the financial relief eased some of her burdens, it did nothing to fill the void Elijah had left. Daisha walked past parks and playgrounds on her way to work, her eyes lingering on children running and laughing, each one a reminder of the boy she had named Joshua. She wondered if she could find a way to bridge the gap between the life she had signed away and the one she still yearned for, even as the weight of her decision pressed heavier with each passing day. 6 months after Elijah's birth, Daisha could no longer bear the weight of her loss. The money from the surrogacy had cleared her debts, but the emptiness in her heart grew heavier each day. She spent sleepless nights scrolling through legal forums, her phone's dim light casting shadows across her cramped Omaha apartment. The stories of surrogates who had challenged their contracts, though rare and often unsuccessful, fueled a spark of defiance in her. She decided to fight for Elijah, the boy she still thought of as Joshua. With most of her surrogacy payments still in her bank account, she sought out a lawyer, a middle-aged woman named Susan, who worked out of a small office downtown. Susan specialized in family law and took Daisha's case after listening to her story, though she warned that the legal battle would be steep. Daisha handed over nearly all her remaining funds to cover the retainer, determined to reclaim some connection to the child she had carried. The process began with Susan filing a lawsuit in an Omaha courthouse, claiming that the surrogacy contract lacked transparency and that Daisha had not been fully informed of its emotional and legal implications. Daisha spent hours in Susan's office, recounting every detail of her experience with the clinic, her meetings with the coordinator, the medical procedures, and the fleeting moments she saw Elijah before he was taken away. Susan pored over the contract, searching for loopholes, and argued that Daisha's consent had been coerced by her financial desperation. Daisha clung to this argument, hoping it would sway a judge, but she felt a gnawing fear that her efforts would be futile against the clinic's airtight legal framework and Martez and Claire's resources. The courtroom, a wood-panelled room with high ceilings and rows of benches, became a battleground. Daisha attended every hearing, dressed in the same navy blazer she had bought second-hand for the occasion. She sat quietly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as Susan presented her case. Martez and Claire, represented by a team of polished attorneys from a high-profile law firm, sat across the aisle. Their lawyers portrayed Daisha as an unstable opportunist, emphasizing her voluntary signature on the contract and her lack of genetic connection to Elijah. They presented Martez and Claire as devoted parents who had planned for their child meticulously. Their wealth and stability contrasted sharply with Daisha's modest circumstances. The disparity stung, but Daisha held her head high, her resolve strengthened by the memory of Elijah's tiny hand in the hospital. The hearings stretched over weeks, each one draining Daisha's emotional reserves. She continued working at the supermarket, her shifts now a blur of exhaustion as she juggled court dates and long nights preparing with Susan. The judge, a stern woman with wire-rimmed glasses, listened impassively as both sides presented their arguments. Susan introduced evidence of Daisha's financial hardship at the time of signing, suggesting the clinic had exploited her vulnerability. But Martez and Claire's attorneys countered with affidavits from the clinic's staff, who testified that Daisha had been thoroughly counselled and had entered the agreement willingly. They produced the contract itself, its pages marked with Daisha's signature, as undeniable proof of her commitment to relinquish all rights. Daisha felt the weight of those pages, each one a reminder of the choice she had made in desperation. As the trial progressed, Daisha's hope began to waver. She sat through testimony that dissected her life, her low income, her unfinished education, her small apartment, painting her as unfit to even visit Elijah. Martez and Claire's attorneys argued that disrupting Elijah's life would harm him, emphasizing the stable, loving home they provided. Daisha wanted to scream that she loved him too, that she had felt him grow inside her, but the courtroom's rigid structure left no room for such outbursts. Instead, she poured her feelings into late-night journal entries, filling the same notebook she had used during her pregnancy with words of longing and frustration. She wrote about Elijah's birth, about the moment she saw his face, hoping that somehow her words could bridge the gap between her and the child she had lost. The judge delivered her ruling on a grey November afternoon. Daisha sat frozen as the decision was read. The contract was legally binding, and Daisha had no parental rights to Elijah. The court denied her request for visitation, citing the need to protect the child's stability with Martez and Claire. The gavel's sharp crack echoed in Daisha's ears, sealing her defeat. She left the courthouse in a daze, the cold air biting at her face as she walked to the bus stop. Back in her apartment, she collapsed onto her couch, the silence deafening. The loss felt like a fresh wound, sharper than the day she had signed Elijah away. She stopped writing in her notebook, unable to face the pages that held her hopes. Depression settled over her, a heavy fog that dulled her days and kept her awake at night. Yet amidst the despair, a small spark remained. Susan called Daisha a week after the ruling, her voice cautious but urgent. While reviewing the clinic's medical records for an appeal, she had noticed an inconsistency in the documentation of the in vitro fertilization process. The records listed a batch number for the embryo that didn't align with the timeline of Claire's egg retrieval. Susan couldn't be certain without further investigation, but the discrepancy suggested a possible error in the clinic's procedures. For Daisha, this news was a faint lifeline, a thread of hope in the darkness. She clutched her phone, her heart racing, as she considered the possibility that the truth about Elijah's origins might not be as clear as the contract had claimed. Though defeated in court, she felt a renewed determination to uncover the truth, even if it meant starting the fight all over again. 3 years had passed since the courtroom defeat, and Daisha's life in Omaha had become a relentless cycle of work and quiet determination. She juggled 2 jobs, her familiar shifts at the supermarket and late-night hours cleaning offices in a downtown high-rise. The extra income went into a savings account, every dollar earmarked for a new legal battle. The pain of losing Elijah never dulled, but it fueled her resolve. She lived frugally in her small apartment, the same one with the creaking floorboards and chipped paint, refusing to spend the remaining surrogacy money on anything but her fight. Her nights were spent researching online, scouring legal blogs and support groups for surrogates, hoping to find a precedent that could reopen her case. The notebook where she had once written about Joshua remained untouched in a drawer, too painful to open, but too precious to discard. Her lawyer, Susan, had not given up either. She worked pro bono on Daisha's case, driven by a sense of injustice and the nagging discrepancy she had found in the clinic's records. Susan spent months navigating bureaucratic hurdles to gain access to the clinic's internal documents, filing requests under Nebraska's public records laws, and leveraging contacts in the medical field. Her persistence paid off when a former clinic employee, now retired, agreed to provide archived files from the in vitro fertilization process. Late one evening in 2024, Susan called Daisha with news that changed everything. The documents revealed a lab error. The embryo implanted in Daisha had been created using her own egg, not Claire's. Elijah, the boy Daisha had carried and lost, was her biological son. The revelation hit Daisha like a wave, a mix of elation and fury washing over her. She sat on her couch, clutching a worn pillow, as tears streamed down her face, the weight of 3 years of grief colliding with the possibility of reclaiming her child. The discovery turned Daisha's quiet resolve into a burning mission. She met Susan the next day at her office, a cluttered space filled with legal books and coffee-stained files. Susan explained the implications. The clinic's error could invalidate parts of the surrogacy contract, as it had been based on the assumption that Elijah was genetically Martez and Claire's. Daisha's hands shook as she reviewed the lab reports, the technical jargon blurring into proof of her connection to Elijah. Susan filed a new lawsuit, this time demanding recognition of Daisha's maternal rights and a re-examination of the original custody ruling. The paperwork cited negligence by the clinic and argued that Daisha's biological tie to Elijah gave her a legal claim. Daisha felt a surge of hope, but also a new fear. The fight would disrupt Elijah's life, the only life he had known with Martez and Claire. The case quickly drew attention beyond the courthouse. A local journalist, tipped off by a court clerk, published an article about the lawsuit in an Omaha newspaper. The story spread, picked up by regional news outlets and amplified on social media. Reporters framed it as a human interest piece, highlighting the ethical complexities of surrogacy and the clinic's mistake. Daisha avoided the spotlight, declining interviews and shielding her face from cameras outside the courthouse. She wanted the focus to remain on Elijah, not her personal struggle. But the publicity reached Martez and Claire, who were blindsided by the revelation. They had raised Elijah as their own, celebrating his first steps, his first words, and his 3rd birthday with a backyard party. The news that he was Daisha's biological son shook their world, forcing them to confront the possibility of losing him. They hired their legal team again, preparing to defend their family while grappling with the truth about Elijah's origins. Daisha's days became a blur of preparation and anxiety. She met with Susan weekly, reviewing evidence and strategizing for the upcoming hearings. The clinic, now under scrutiny, issued a public apology for the error, but maintained that the original contract still held legal weight. Daisha spent her breaks at work, reading court documents, her phone screen filled with legal terms she struggled to understand. She thought constantly of Elijah, now a toddler, wondering if he looked like her, if he laughed the way she imagined Joshua would. The media coverage brought letters from strangers, some offering support, others accusing her of trying to tear apart a happy family. The weight of public opinion pressed on her, but she focused on the image of Elijah's face from that brief moment in the hospital, a memory that kept her moving forward. As the court date approached, Daisha faced a moral dilemma that gnawed at her. She wanted Elijah back, to hold him and raise him as her own, but she couldn't ignore the life he had with Martez and Claire. The articles described them as loving parents, their home filled with toys and pictures of Elijah's milestones. Daisha wondered if pursuing the lawsuit would hurt her son, uprooting him from the only family he knew. She lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, torn between her love for Elijah and the fear of causing him pain. Susan encouraged her to stay focused on the legal argument, but Daisha's heart wrestled with the human cost. She began to consider alternatives, perhaps shared custody or visitation, but the thought of settling for less than full motherhood felt like another loss. The media frenzy grew, with talk shows debating the ethics of surrogacy and online forums dissecting Daisha's motives. She avoided the noise, unplugging her television and limiting her internet use to case-related research. Her mother, who had been distant during the first lawsuit, called to check on her, but Daisha kept their conversations short, unable to share the depth of her turmoil. The possibility of seeing Elijah again kept her going, even as the legal process loomed like an insurmountable mountain. Susan warned that the case could take months, but Daisha was ready to fight, driven by the truth that Elijah was hers in a way no contract could erase. As she stepped into the courthouse for the first hearing, her heart pounded with a mix of hope and dread, knowing the battle ahead would test every ounce of her strength. The courtroom in Omaha became a second home for Daisha as the lawsuit dragged on through the spring and summer of 2024. Each hearing chipped away at her energy, the endless testimonies and legal arguments weaving a web of tension that followed her back to her small apartment. She sat through days of proceedings, her hands folded tightly in her lap, listening as experts confirmed her biological connection to Elijah through DNA evidence. The clinic's error was undeniable, but the judge faced a complex dilemma. Elijah, now 3 years old, had known only Martez and Claire as his parents. Child psychologists called as witnesses described the potential trauma of removing him from his home, emphasizing his attachment to the couple who had raised him. Daisha's heart sank with each warning, her dream of reclaiming her son clashing with the reality of his established life. The media circus outside the courthouse intensified, with reporters camping out to catch glimpses of Daisha, Martez, or Claire. Daisha kept her head down, avoiding cameras, but the weight of public scrutiny pressed on her. Online, strangers debated her motives, some calling her a mother fighting for her child, others labeling her a disruptor of a happy family. She stopped checking social media, focusing instead on the legal strategy sessions with Susan, who remained steadfast in her advocacy. The judge, a measured woman with a reputation for fairness, took weeks to deliberate, weighing the biological truth against Elijah's emotional well-being. Daisha spent those weeks in a state of restless anticipation, her days at the supermarket and nights cleaning offices blurring into a haze of exhaustion and hope. In late August, the judge delivered her ruling. Daisha sat in the courtroom, her breath shallow, as the decision was read. The court recognized her as Elijah's biological mother and granted her the status of a co-parent with rights to regular visitation, but primary custody remained with Martez and Claire. The judge cited Elijah's need for stability, noting that he had formed a secure bond with his current family. Daisha's heart ached at the partial victory. She had longed to bring Elijah home to raise him as her own, but she saw the wisdom in the compromise. She nodded silently as Susan squeezed her hand, accepting that this was the best outcome for her son, even if it wasn't the one she had dreamed of. The ruling included a schedule for supervised visits, starting with weekly meetings at a neutral location. The first visit took place in a community centre in Omaha, a bright room with colourful toys and a social worker present to observe. Daisha arrived early, her stomach knotted with nerves, carrying a small stuffed bear she had bought at a thrift store. When Martez and Claire brought Elijah in, Daisha's breath caught. He was taller than she had imagined, with a curious gaze and a quick smile. He clung to Claire's hand at first, unsure of the stranger before him, but Daisha knelt to his level, offering the bear. Over the hour, he warmed to her, stacking blocks while she sat nearby, watching his every move. The visits continued weekly, each one a step toward building a connection. Daisha learned his favourite games, the way he giggled when she made silly faces, and the songs that calmed him. She treasured these moments, even as they ended with him returning to Martez and Claire. Martez and Claire, initially guarded, began to soften as they saw Daisha's gentle approach. They had feared she would try to take Elijah away, but her focus on his happiness reassured them. Over time, they invited her to their home for visits, allowing Elijah to grow comfortable with her in familiar surroundings. The house, a tidy suburban home with a swing set in the backyard, was filled with signs of Elijah's life: drawings on the fridge, toys scattered on the floor. Daisha felt a pang of envy, but also gratitude that her son was loved and cared for. She brought small gifts, like books or homemade cookies, and shared stories of her own childhood, hoping to weave herself into Elijah's world without disrupting it. The clinic, facing lawsuits from other affected families, settled with Daisha out of court, offering a substantial compensation for their error. She used the money to lease a small storefront in North Omaha, where she opened a bakery, a dream she had once thought impossible. The shop, with its warm smell of fresh bread and display case of cupcakes, became her refuge. She poured her energy into perfecting recipes, her hands kneading dough as she processed the bittersweet reality of her new role in Elijah's life. The bakery drew a steady stream of customers, giving her financial stability and a sense of purpose. She hung a photo of Elijah behind the counter, taken during one of their visits, his smile a quiet anchor in her daily routine. As months turned into a year, Daisha, Martez, Claire, and Elijah found a fragile but growing balance. They met regularly, sometimes at the park or the bakery, where Elijah would run to Daisha, calling her by her first name, but with a warmth that felt like family. Martez and Claire began to share updates about Elijah's milestones, his first day of preschool, his love for dinosaurs, inviting Daisha to small celebrations. Daisha, in turn, respected their role as his primary parents, careful not to overstep. The arrangement wasn't perfect. Moments of longing for a different outcome still crept in, especially when she returned to her quiet apartment. But seeing Elijah thrive, surrounded by love from 3 adults, brought her a peace she hadn't known since his birth. She no longer felt like she was fighting against Martez and Claire, but with them, united by their shared devotion to the boy who had changed their lives.